are new to us, the EDCC is a statewide industry association that supports economic development efforts across the state of Colorado. We connect our communities, our members, and our partners to high-quality educational opportunities and trusted resources, and advocate for sound policies and programs, and to support a vibrant economy and enhance quality of life for all of Colorado. EDCC has built a virtual arsenal of information to keep our professionals updated on the latest trends, data, case studies, and thought leadership papers that our professionals can take back to their local leaders to begin their important discussions at the local level. Make this feature a part of your ongoing professional development and tool that you can use to help inform, educate, and transform your community. I'd like to take a quick moment to share with you our 2023 events and programming lineup. 2 upcoming events to make note of. Back after a 3-year hiatus is our Regional Economic Development Forum, which is scheduled for May 10th in Fort Morgan during Economic Development Week. Join EDCC and our member organizations, Downtown Colorado Inc., Eve Lieberman, Executive Director of OEDIT, Elizabeth Gardner, our state demographer, and an amazing lineup of speakers addressing tough economic development issues and opportunities for Colorado and the Eastern Plains. We'll also be celebrating Economic Development Week that week. And so we hope that you all can help in creating your own celebrations and doing your social media so that we can also be tagging and following you. What we see as success for Economic Development Week is that we are blowing up the airways that whole week, talking about the importance and value of economic development. Coming up in June is our basic economic development course, June 12th through the 16th. At the Commons on Champa. The BEDC course provides a substantial introduction to theory and fundamentals of comprehensive economic development. The formal instruction emphasizes beneficial development that can result from the constructive actions of local leaders. And it revolves around 5 major themes: innovative community development concepts, regional economics, basic factors in development, techniques of economic development, and trends in economic development. So now, without further ado, let's move on to today's Knowledge Network series. So you may be curious as to why the Knowledge Network. We have learned a lot in the last few years about the power of collaboration and connectivity. EDCC continues to foster the professional network that we are so proud of here in Colorado. We have a treasure trove of leaders in our community of economic development professionals that have learned tricks of the trade, best practices, and quite possibly from their mistakes. After all, that's how we all learn. This is our time to come together as an industry and support one another. We want to see each of you succeed in your job, in your community, and in the profession. So today we're talking about creative funding sources for economic development organizations. Let's face it, we have a lot on our plates as economic developers. We're meeting with area businesses, developing programs to support job creation, policy, and education, convening community stakeholders. Fundraising and advocacy for your organization or your department is sometimes time intensive and in some cases not as viewed as essential. Please join our panel of experts today as they share their unique case studies on how they've found creative and sustainable funding solutions that support the organization while allowing them to do what they do best, economic development. The credit goes to our Professional Development Committee for devising today's session and the series. They are a group of amazing professionals with great energy and leadership, led by Shannon Hine with the City of Fort Collins and Tyler Purvis with the City of Brush. If you are a member and interested in getting involved, we've dropped their contact information in the chat section. Today's programming is brought to you by City of Westminster and Xcel Energy. We can't thank our sponsors enough for supporting EDCC's efforts in distributing information across Colorado and helping build a strong economic development ecosystem. With that, I'd like to introduce to you today our moderator, Kate Coldecourt, founder and CEO of Strategy Architect. Kate is an award-winning strategy coach and business mentor with 2 decades of experience in strategic planning and organizational design. She has worked with global corporations, small businesses, and nonprofit organizations, helping leaders grow their impact and turn their vision into a sustainable legacy. Kate was previously the global strategy manager at OtterBox, where she developed and implemented strategies across EMEA, APAC, and the Americas, and built human resource departments for international markets. Kate has an exceptional ability to bring structure and clarity to the fast-paced and unpredictable nature of modern business, accelerating the achievement of results. And we are so lucky to have her in our network. So let's give Kate, a warm Zoom welcome. Kate, I'm going to be turning it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kim, for that great and wonderful introduction. And I'm so grateful to be here today and have to learn from all these wonderful panelists in today's topic, which is all about really, as we've spoken, creating creative funding solutions for economic development. So we all know that economic development is a critical component for the growth and sustainability of our communities. However, funding can be really challenging, and particularly for small or under-resourced areas also. And that's where really these creative funding solutions come in. And also, as we start to explore some of these creative solutions, we also want to consider, how do we keep our organizations and the mission at the forefront of our decision making? And how do we prioritize our values and goals to ensure that the funding does not really just dictate our direction, but we can still have a sustainable organization with the necessary resources to drive economic growth? So again, they're very challenging, and it's all about that balance. And I'm very excited for our panelists of experts today to explore and to share with you the innovative and creative ways that they have found funding models to support their organizations, and also how they remain mission driven whilst doing that. So we have three amazing panelists today. We have Kristen Clifford Basil from Morgan County EDC. We have Jansen Tidmore from Jefferson County EDC. And we have Daniel Riley from Arvada Economic Development Association. So I'm going to allow each of the panelists to introduce themselves, share their approach on how they have found creative and sustainable models to fund their organization. And then once each panelist has had an opportunity to speak, we'll open it up to Q&A. So please add those questions to the chat. And as Kim said, she'll be moderating the chat and able to share out those questions as well. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Kristen to share a little bit about her organization, her approach, and any other creative funding models that she has seen in existence that she would like to discuss.
Okay. So my name's Kristen. I'm the executive director for Morgan County Economic Development, which is in northeastern Colorado. The population of the county is about 30,000, and I started in January of 2020. So when I started, pandemic hit shortly after and created a number of challenges, but it identified opportunities for the organization. We were financially struggling when I started. And then as the pandemic hit and all of the grant and funding opportunities came about, we realized as a C6, we didn't qualify for a lot of those opportunities. So we applied for a C3 in 2021, and then we're awarded that C3 in 2022. And we did that to diversify our funding structure, so that we could go after more grant opportunities and take advantage of that indirect cost that you can write into your grant budgets to help fund the organization. And then we also have a revolving loan fund. And I think we might be the only economic development organization that manages their own revolving loan fund. And we're looking at ways we can leverage that by investing that money and using the interest we accrue on that to help with the operation expenses or other programming. And in 2020, we also took over the management of tourism. So that came with an annual budget to help us hire a part-time person. So my office is set up with one full-time person, me, and a part-time assistant. And we manage the C6, the C3, tourism, and the revolving loan fund. I think I hit all the marks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Kristen. Appreciate it. Next, we'll go over to Jansen to share a little bit about Jefferson County EDC and how he has created sustainable funding models for the organization.
Good morning. Yeah, so I'm coming up on 3 years in this role, having joined in May of 2020, and coming in a pandemic is certainly has its challenges, but certainly has its advantages as well. And so Jeffco EDC, what I came into was an organization that's the oldest EDO in the state, founded in 1955, serving the third largest population in the state, nearly 600,000 residents, and a staff of 2.5. And so we were looking at the numbers and looking at our government funding. And over the last decade, the government side of our equation is a 501c6. 10 years ago was funding about 60% of our budget. Today is currently funding about 30% of our budget. And while I'd love to say that it's because of a huge increase of private investment in others, that's not the case. There's been cuts after cuts after cuts of government funding, specifically from our county, towards our budgets. And that has made us look at things a little bit differently. And so coming in the pandemic, I started looking around the table, started looking around the community and what we do as economic developers, and said, there are a lot of organizations and we share the same pie. We're not growing that pie. It's not a different change. There's 7 chambers of commerce. There's 1 EDC. There's 5 or 6 other business associations asking for membership. So how do we create a mechanism to make sure that we're getting our share of that based on the work? And so in 2022, we rolled the West Metro Chamber of Commerce under our umbrella. We rolled Leadership Jeffco under our umbrella and grew our staff from 2.5 to 9 while growing our budget about 2.5 times as well. What this allowed us to do is open up a host of new opportunities, because with that leadership, Jeffco came a 501c3 foundation, which allows us to look at some of the grants and some of the different funds that as a 501c6 we weren't eligible for. But it also allowed us to align our methodology and our goals and objectives with staff and within this right department. So economic development, we get pulled in a lot of ways. Our governments want us to go out there and create jobs and create capital investment. Our private sector, let's be very, very honest. For my private sector, it is about advocacy, land use, zoning, and planning. That's where I spend 90% of my time, is around those sectors. And that's what they're hiring us to do. That's what they're investing in. That's what they want, is that voice for business that is there. In that equation, our small businesses were often left out, and now our chamber mechanism really allows us to grab that pool, and Leadership Jeffco becomes this bucket and this opportunity for us to really engage, convene, and build a unique conversation that we've often been around the table on, but maybe haven't really known our place. Topics such as housing, topics such as early childhood education, topics like homelessness, some of these very challenging, overarching, that maybe I know as an economic developer, kind of throwing my hands up and said, that's somebody else's problem. Well, now we've created that mechanism that allows for that convening. And here's what's happened. We've been able to take administrative burden. We've been able to take some of the overhead costs, some of the things that all of our organizations have to pay. And every time we create a new organization, we have to duplicate. We've been able to pull that under one mechanism, really reduce those costs, and be able to put more money towards our missions, because that's what we were missing. How do I make sure that I've got as much money going to economic development as I can? And how can I make that laser focused so that we can create jobs, capital investment? How can I make sure these small businesses are getting the support that they need? And how can I make sure that we're still being relevant around these more complicated topics? And that's the model that we've really built. And so now our private investments hovering around 53% of our budget. Our public sector is sitting just under 30%, but we have managed to keep it leveled funding for the last 3 years. It is a decrease, and it has been a consistent one from where it was, but I will take and maintain a status quo. We're sitting at about 7% grants. And I did want to talk about grants because I think it's very, very important. It may be easy, and people always say, well, just go get a grant for that. But we've been very strategic in the partnerships we've done around that it furthers our cause and doesn't add another layer of bureaucracy or another path that doesn't meet our mission. Money that comes in that requires me to do something that's not a core focus is a distraction. So I don't care if they give me $20, $30, $40, $50,000 to do that. I'm likely going to spend more than that on top of matching time and effort, and I'm detracting from these other things. And so we've been very intentional about the grants we've taken and how we've taken those. The rest of that comes from the internal cost share, miscellaneous, and events. I'd love to get events up higher, but Kim, probably as you can attest, that's been a challenge these last 3 years to make money on events. And so we've really gone towards content driven and finding ways to provide value, not necessarily build our budget, but hopefully at least break even on it. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you very much for that, Jansen. Very informative around the multiple different ways you've shifted your funding model to really suit your mission and what you're trying to achieve. So fantastic. Thank you very much for that. And next over to Daniel Riley of the Arvada Economic Development Association to share a little bit about his background, his organization, and how he's creating innovative and sustainable funding models for his organization.
Yeah, thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces here on the call. Again, Daniel Riley, Executive Director of Arvada Economic Development Association. Going on 9 years with the organization this summer. So it's been a great opportunity and very grateful to serve the Arvada community in that capacity. And I'll just be honest, the kind of title or pitch for this session was creative funding mechanisms. And I would say we're not that creative, but I would say we're really, really unique. And in fact, I believe we're the only model that operates the way we do in the country. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. There are organizations kind of similar to ours. I'd say even here locally, the Brighton Economic Development has a similar model where they get funding directly from the city, but they also have investors, private investors, much like Jansen's model. AIDA, however, is 100% funded through the city, but it comes in 2 different ways. One is we actually set up a private nonprofit, a 501c6, the Arvada Economic Development Association. That was actually spun out of the Arvada Chamber of Commerce back in 1991. And that plays a little bit, the history plays a little bit into what I'll talk about with kind of the pros and cons of our model. But the AIDA Board of Directors is one of my bosses, and then the Arvada City Council is another one of my bosses. So the Arvada Board, or the Economic Development Association Board of Directors actually goes to City Council and petitions them for funds in the form of a large grant that they will use to deploy and fulfill their economic development mission. So that relationship has been very strong and sustainable, and it's a reliable source of funding for the board. But when that money passes through from City Council into the nonprofit, it kind of goes through a bit of a membrane that allows the AIDA board to use that money in ways that maybe City Council wouldn't or couldn't. And it gives City Council a lot of cover from being, exposed to taking positions of formal support on economic development projects that might conflict with other community perspectives, so to speak. For example, we all know living especially in the metro area, commercial development oftentimes will rub against residential neighborhoods and sometimes create some friction. So it gives the City Council a lot of cover when that money goes to the board. And it's really the board, which is made up of business owners and leaders in the Arvada community. They dictate how those funds are used. They will tell us as staff where we want to put these funds, how do we want to optimize these towards our mission, and really maximize the benefit to our business environment, our existing businesses, and new businesses that want to come in, or commercial real estate development opportunities. And so the board can actually move a lot more quickly and a lot more flexibly, and they're very nimble in how that money gets deployed. Whereas going through a public process to maybe come to City Council every time we need to engage some sort of financial support for a project can take a lot of time, because there's a lot of public hearings and postings of notices. And then again, you kind of open up a can of worms when you invite the community into every single deal. A lot of times we want the community's input on larger deals, but sometimes if it's just a small grant to help retain an existing business, we can move very quickly and very efficiently through that process. So that money that the board gets is 100% dedicated to programs that the board wants to do. As the model works in Arvada, which makes us so unique, is that myself and my team are employed directly by the city of Arvada. So technically we're city employees, but we're on loan to serve that board. And therefore we can kind of in tandem work as the internal economic development department for the city, serving City Council's economic development interests. And there we have a dedicated budget through the general fund as well, which we use to cover all of our salary and benefits. We use to cover all of our marketing expenses, our technology, our equipment, just our organizational and operational costs. That means that there's no overhead for the board. So the board, every cent that they get gets reinvested into the Arvada business community or development projects. And then we cover all of that overhead on the internal budget side. So it gives us a really interesting way to operate. And Kate mentioned the word balance. Yeah, that's very key, of understanding how to really wear 2 hats simultaneously. Are we the nonprofit, or are we the local government hat? And what's the right time to put those hats on, and what's the value proposition to kind of leading any initiatives from either side, or can we partner together? A lot of times we'll do that. The board will partner with city council on opportunities where both organizations need to come together to make something work. So that is a pretty unique, again, model that we found. We haven't seen anyone in the country doing it that specific way. And one of the reasons I think that that's difficult to replicate is because it takes a tremendous amount of trust between your business community and your city council. For city council or a board of county commissioners to kind of write a blank check, so to speak, and say, kind of go out and do this, and to just trust a independent, autonomous board of business owners to do the right thing with that money and to make sure it's aligned. So a big part of my job is just making sure those things stay aligned. So it's all about the relationships that we cultivate with our business community, really listening and understanding what their needs and expectations are, and using the AIDA board as a channel for those voices to be heard and really influence city council and policies around land development use and taxation and all kinds of things going on kind of internally at the city regulatory environment. And simultaneously reassuring city council that the board is really good stewards of that money through reporting outcomes and performance, having strategic plans, and getting buy-in from both the board and city council to adopt the identical strategic plan. So we're moving in a parallel direction with both organizations, and not really pulling apart or moving in opposite directions that create any strife or friction there. So that process to develop that trust between your business community and your elected officials may take years. It may take decades. And going back to 1991, I'd say it took about 10 years before the organization really started to click and really found its groove and found how to really navigate that very delicate space. And so if your community has enough, I think, patience to start investing in those relationships and bringing your businesses and elected officials together to the point where they can agree that this type of model could work, I think it can be replicated, and I think it could be very successful. The benefit for us as staff is we don't spend any time fundraising except when we need to kind of refill the coffers of the board. We'll go back to city council, and again, that's the board going to city council asking for funding. It's not me as a city employee, and so that I think is very possible if there's a willingness from those communities to participate in that conversation and have trust and leadership within both organizations to kind of keep that conversation close enough together that over time you can get to a place where that can be a funding model. So hopefully that gives a little bit of insight into the way we do things in Arvada. Again, highly unique, not so creative. We're very single stream as far as where the money comes from, but I think it can be a valuable way to approach economic development. And again, to Kate's point, allow us to really focus our energy and efforts on the work we do as opposed to trying to find where we're going to get funds to survive.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel. As I said, we'll open it up to Q&A now. I have a few questions just to kick us off, and then we'll also get some of those audience conversations going as well. So Daniel, just let's stick with you as you were discussing there about that, unique balance that you have between acting as this nonprofit, but also local government. We know that a lot of economic development organizations do receive public funding, and it can often create the decisions that they make can be affected and influenced by receiving funds from that source. So can you provide us with it sounds like you're doing this very successfully. So what are some lessons learned along the way that you have that's made this work really well for your organization? And any tips that we have for this group on how to really maximize that type of funding?
Yeah, thank you. A couple things I can point to. One, I think, is the nurturing and the intentional relational cultivation between the board and city council. Especially on the city council side, we don't want to just go off and disappear and then all of a sudden come back with our hand out. We have very intentional strategic planning and reporting. We have performance metrics, very measurable smart oriented goals, time bound goals that we set for the board that say we want to do this with your money, or the public's money. And then we report that back monthly. On a monthly basis. We put together a report of our progress towards our strategic goals and outcomes that gets shared with City Council, always keeping them in the loop, always making sure that they're aware of not only how the money had been invested into what specific projects and programs, but also what were the outcomes, what were the benefits to the community, what was the ROI. And that's something we can measure, again, having the luxury of working on the city side as well. Internally, we can go into City Hall and we can have relationships with our finance team, for example, to say, we put X amount of grant dollars into these projects that resulted in these businesses. What was the tax revenue to the penny that was created by those projects? And we could go back to City Council, and then the board comes and says, for every dollar you put into our organization, you saw X amount return to you in hard cash through tax revenue. So there's a very simple mathematical case to be made at that point, in addition to all the anecdotal and sort of intangible side of the community benefits and the cool businesses that we see happen and the cool projects that come to fruition and the amenities that are delivered to the residents. So we're telling that story continually. So there's no surprises. It's not like City Council writes a check and we just disappear and then, 3 years later say, hey, we're out of money. Can we get some more? They're very much in the loop. A member of City Council sits on our board as a voting member. City Council also has 4 appointees that they put on our board. And the trust there is so strong that they usually look at us and say, you tell us what 4 people to fill those appointee seats with, because the business community knows better than us. You're doing such a good job. You're such good stewards. We have so much trust that let you guide us. You tell us where the need is, and we'll partner and follow suit. So it's really nurturing that, I think, is most important, and having really high quality ways to set measurable, meaningful goals and report on progress and outcomes. I think you cannot do one without the other. The last thing I'll say is that I think the challenge is, as the communities continue to evolve and change, especially in the metro area, I think the residents see a lot more, they start to communicate a lot more interest in things like housing issues and homelessness issues and crime and safety issues. And sometimes that can play into the amount of funding that's available to fund any organization or any initiative. And so I think year over year, we find ourselves competing against other really important things that City Council has to think about for those funds. So even though we're doing all these great things, we can demonstrate this ROI, we can show that we're good stewards, we still can't take that for granted. We still have to go in and almost compete against interests that are still very critical to our communities that I just mentioned, and demonstrate that we are a means to an end for some of those issues that the community is facing. So that's a tip I would say that I would say is kind of have that holistic perspective too. It's not just about the economic development outcomes, but how can economic development in your organization specifically benefit or these other challenges that are really rising to a high level of priority in our communities around a lot of these really tough circumstances we're in.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel. That's very informative, I'm sure, for a lot of the people on this webinar, due to the fact that the funding model is often a lot to do, comes in from that public source. So thank you. And both then Kristen and Jansen also spoke about using structure and that 501c3 to really support their funding model. So first to Kristen, I'd like to ask you, what informed that decision to really set up that structure of a 501c3, and then what have been some of the really great opportunities associated with that, and perhaps some of the challenges also?
I think one of the major drivers was, how can we better help our businesses when they need financial assistance, or for whether it's for operations during a hard time or if they're going through an expansion. And most private companies don't have access to foundations or different funding sources to help with that grant support. So one driving force was being a fiscal sponsor for our investor businesses, so that we can help them expand, because then that grows our tax base and that helps us engage with them and build up the local economy. one success we've had with it, well, a couple, was for the block, which is where you'll be on May 10th for the event. And for Morgan is a facility that transitioned from a restaurant to a commissary, kitchen, and event space. And we applied for congressional directed spending dollars on their behalf, and we were awarded $257,000. So 25,000 of that will go to our C3 to where we can leverage that for grant programming for other businesses. We're really focused on business education, specifically fiscal acumen. We know a lot of small businesses struggle with understanding just business finance and how to apply for a loan. So looking at how we can support them and provide funding to encourage that or develop a program that encourages that. And then that falls in line with our revolving loan fund. And how, if they go through this program we're working on right now, it strengthens their partnership with the bank, and we're working on that partnership with the bank. So we truly are gap funding. We have a business that went to a bank and they didn't qualify, so they sent them to us to do the full loan for them. But I went back and said, how can we partner and not do the full 25, but what is it needed from your end to make the loan work? So it's all kind of cyclical on how do all of our funding sources and programs work together. So it alleviates my workload, and it's all kind of in line and on stack, and not all over the place where I have to kind of transition my brain function multiple times throughout the day to get one thing done. So.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Kristen. And then Jansen as well, we know you've set up 501c3 as well, but I want to discuss that as well. But I'd also really love to discuss how you talked about really the pie isn't growing, you're just accessing more of the pie, and how you're kind of consolidating or convening some of these other organizations to support a greater mission and that collaboration. I'd love to learn a little bit more about that, and what informed, again, you making that decision. And again, similar to the question to Kristen, like, what has worked out really well and what are some of the challenges that other economic development organizations may come across if they chose the same path?
Yeah, so I think you heard Daniel touch a little bit on the fact that homelessness and housing, and I mean, these are real issues, and they're real issues for economic development. And what I saw is when we had a multitude of different entities, the same people were getting called to all these tables and all these conversations. And that means we're using time and resources to talk about the same thing. And if we didn't have someone there, then we're out of the conversation. And that was a problem as well. So it was like a step back and said, let's rethink this, because we are playing in that same pool of money, but we're all like spending triple the resources to send people to represent us around that table. How can we take a step back, keep a relevant seat at the table, but make sure that our resources and our people are getting to go and do the work that they're doing? And so by creating what we call them the 3 verticals under the umbrella, my economic development team, which has a VP who's over attraction and 2 people who are over retention, they don't get called to all these separate meetings, because when it's small business or consumer facing business, I bring in the chamber team, which allows that economic development team to work on primary employers and their issues in supply chain and manufacturing. And then when we have topics like homelessness and early childhood education, I'm able to implement the leadership team over there. But then that information flows across the umbrella and goes back to, I'm governed by a 32-member board. Of my 32 members, 8 are elected officials. Another 4 or 5 of those are community, nonprofits, schools, education, and then rounded out with the private sector. And because now we have 9 people in these 3 entities that are getting to go represent the collective, we're able to spend more time and energy around those laser focused goals and objectives. And so to me, it was really about how we're using those time and how we can make sure that there's a presence there and that the EDC can influence change across the spectrum, but without having to send so many people, without having to spend so many resources to do it. And so that was really the concept, was when 12 organizations all send someone, that's 12 people that aren't going out and working on businesses. When one collective voice for business could do that, but we never really got to who that collective voice. And I think we're really working to do that. I think we saw in the pandemic, I mean, businesses are getting tapped out. Costs are going up. I don't think the pie is growing. Maybe I'm wrong in that, but I'm not seeing the amount of money that's flowing back into our types of industry growing much at all. And in fact, I'm seeing it being a little bit more limited. And so when I talk about that private side investment, we can't kid ourselves. It comes with strings attached as well. And in Colorado and in Jefferson County, those strings attached is state advocacy, land use, and zoning policy. That's where we spend a lot of time and effort. And that's why that C6 is so important. If I was to go to a straight C3 model, there's no way I could bring in the private investment that I need, because that C6 allows us that advocacy that is so critical and so important and such a big part of what those private investors are looking to us for. And so the C3, when it came along with the leadership program, it was nice to have, but for us, it wasn't a critical element, because most of our donations and most of our investments aren't from the individuals. So what it really did was open up the grant opportunity more than the private donor pool. That C3 really comes into play on that private donor pool on nonprofits where people are given individual giving. And we haven't really found ourselves to be the beneficiaries of individual giving. But it's hugely critical in how we can approach grants and those opportunities there. So hopefully I answered your question on that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. And please note as well, for any of the attendees, please do put some questions that you have in the chat, and we'll absolutely bring those to the panelists as well. And then just kind of going back to Daniel, right, you had mentioned, you really focus on a single source of funding. Can you tell us a little bit about, have you any, does that ever kind of keep you up in the middle of the night, right? Because it's a single source. How do you kind of manage that to ensure that it's sustainable into the future? And just share a little bit about that, because again, a lot of the people here may be reliant on a single source or heavily reliant. So if you could share with us some of your thoughts on how to maybe mitigate some risks there, or what you do to manage that.
Sure thing. And just going back to kind of the nurturing of the relationships, I can't overstate how important that is. Knowing that is the hand that feeds us, right? So some of the things, I guess, that could keep me up at night. One is if our board started to feel differently and wanted to go in a different direction, that's, I think, the role of the staff to really intervene and say, okay, the board is the important voice because you are the business leaders of the community. But let's figure out how to work in collaboration and alignment. If we feel like the city wants to go in a different direction with economic development, also incumbent upon staff to go in and have those conversations and ensure that we're not going to be moving in a direction that's detrimental for not only the success of the community via its revenue that it gets from business activity, but the real valuable and potentially delicate model that we have, and how hard it would be to rebuild that if we lost and broke that trust. So I think it just reinforces the need for staff to be very hyper aware and focused, and not be asleep at the wheel when it comes to the relational side of the board and the organization, and then city council. Sorry, was there a second part of your question there?
Yeah, no, that was it, Daniel. And I think really it was recapping that it's really about the nurturing of that relationship if you are reliant on that single source. And then I think the other piece is, how do you mitigate against it?
Just came back to me too, what I was going to mention. Yes. Sorry, that keeping me up at night. Elections keep me up at night. So because you never know, you could have a completely different city council on the next day after an election, in theory. And so the good news about the work that we do in this profession is, I believe wholeheartedly and sincerely that economic development is a way to support anyone's goals as an elected official, no matter what side of the aisle they're on, no matter how far on that side of the aisle. If they're concerned about the community and the social welfare and well-being of the community, economic development, jobs, tax base is critical to that. If they're concerned with jobs and small businesses and free market, economic development is critical for those things to be successful as well. So I think the positive, of the silver lining of the elections is, no matter who is in office, I think we have a compelling case, and all of us here on this call have a compelling case to make for why our organizations are critical to the long-term success of the community. So sorry, I interrupted you there, Kay. I had just forgotten that one thing that keeps me up at night.
No, that's perfect. That's great. Thank you. Okay. Tim, you've got some questions from the group.
Yep. So Celeste put into the chat section, we are a small rural area that is also county seat. How do any of you interact with your county as well as city leaders? And then she had a second part to that as well, as Daniel, can you when you formed your model, was it formed in 1991? Is that what you said? Yeah.
I'll take the rural, county, and municipality one because we're a rural community. So we have 3 major municipalities that I work with, and then the county commissioners. We have 3 county commissioners. Elections often keep me up at night as well when they're close, so I empathize with that. One thing that when I started hosting monthly meetings with my city managers and to bring them all together and share information so everybody's getting the same information, and it has, I think, helped create a kind of a forum for us to communicate and share ideas with each other. And then they'll ask if there's a water issue or a funding issue. There's open conversation on that at that platform. And then I also have regular meetings with our county commissioners on a bi-monthly basis where we talk about projects I'm working on that impact the county, and I'll ask, will this be a problem going forward? A lot of them have been in their roles for a very long time, so they know the history of projects and which projects were rejected by citizens and what challenges I might face. So I make sure to just give them a high-level overview of any projects that might be coming along. Then they kind of get that value in having us because we are using taxpayer dollars to fund the organization. And right now the county is the highest funder that we have. Our funding for public bodies is a per capita rate. So every year we look at the per capita and there's a consistent rate that they invest based on the populations. Does that answer your question, Celeste?
And for Jeffco, I can, for Jeffco EDC, we do represent the county and its 6 cities. And so one of the ways that we did that, I mentioned that earlier, is 8 elected officials on the board. All 3 county commissioners have a seat, 1 elected official from each of the 5 cities. We're working to get Edgewater, which is our 6th city, on there and engaged a little bit more as well. And so they have that time to come together every month with the elected officials. We have a great partnership with our cities and our city partners, Daniel and Steve, too, on this call that are that. We also get our ED pros together every other month. So the economic development teams from each of the cities, along with our team, just to go to lunch and do some things and catch up and talk about grants. So it's a good collaborative approach. I think there's been a trust and a faith, and we've shown over the past few years that the Jeffco EDC can take the lead on many aspects of economic development from that regional perspective and countywide perspective, and then hand down to our cities and work hand in hand with them as projects get closer to fruition and narrow in on sites. And so it's communication, it's trust, it's having the seat at the table, and we've built all of those to build those relationships.
Fantastic. Relationships is obviously a huge part of this conversation. So really being able to nurture and manage those right along every aspect. And obviously as new elected officials come in, really being able to make sure that you're building those relationships and nurturing those, which I believe there's actually another excellent EDC knowledge network series about how do you kind of work with those new elected officials. And then Jansen, back to you as well, just a question on your verticals. So you said you created, these kind of 3 verticals really to kind of, create more impact in collaborative impact across, your community. Which came first? Was it like, let's design these verticals and then let's understand the funding model to support them? Or was it like, oh, we need this funding, let's create these verticals? What was your process and your approach to considering that?
Yeah, great question. So again, coming in during the pandemic, while a lot of disadvantages, did have its advantage of really getting to know the organization, the community from a data level and where you wanted to go. And as I said, getting back to our North Star, and we believe that the cornerstone to any healthy community is access to quality jobs. And so many other issues all around the spectrum come back to that cornerstone of, are you providing these opportunities for your residents to have quality jobs? And so that's what we started building off of. We built off of mission. We said, we've got to create jobs. We've got to provide opportunities. That impacts housing. That impacts all these other social issues that are getting all the headlines. And that's where we're going to start with. And we're going to start by making sure not just that we're attracting cool companies, but that the companies we have today have a platform and access to the information to not only stay here, but to grow here. And so we built off of that mission. We rounded out the economic development team. We brought in 2 individuals that do nothing but go out and talk to existing industry. They don't sell investment for the EDC. They don't work in advocacy. They don't work on the chamber side. They go shake hands of existing companies in Jefferson County and say, hey, do you have everything you need? What's some challenges? How can I connect you? Because we don't know all the answers. What we know is how to connect people. From that, we saw a really big gap in small business and consumer facing business. Because look, we deal in primary industries on the EDC side of the equation. We're aerospace, we're bioscience, we're engineering. And so especially in the pandemic, we saw restaurants and retail and these consumer facing industries that were hurting, and we weren't structured and built to help them. We just weren't. As an EDC, that's not how we were built. That's not how we were designed. And so that led to the conversation with the West Metro Chamber, which was going through some transition, going through some pains. And it's like, look, this could provide the mechanism and a staff to double down on those needs and concentrate there. And while that chamber had been trying to get into bigger companies, and a lot of the companies we were working with and almost maybe stepping on toes, we were able to kind of separate and say, no, let's do what we do well. And the chamber can go work on our consumer facing businesses. The EDC can work on our primary businesses. And then that's what led to the third was, okay, now we've got these social topics and these items that really don't fit well on the EDC team, really don't fit well on the chamber team. Leadership Jeffco provides us this convening arm, but all around mission, all around what are our goals and where do we go to? And I'm going to go back to that cornerstone across all three verticals. We believe the cornerstone to a healthy community is access to quality jobs. So in everything that we do, every program that we build, every grant that we go after, how does it impact both creating those jobs and getting workforce that is eligible and qualified for those jobs?
Excellent. Thank you very much. Another question then to all of the panelists. In terms of other funding models that you may have seen other organizations using, and that may be within or within economic development or not, because often we get inspiration from other industries. Are there any other those creative funding models that you've been maybe thinking about in the back of your mind, or that you've seen that you've thought, wow, that could be very interesting for us to look at? And maybe Daniel, we'll go to you first. I know that you have that single source, so it may be a very sustainable model for you. But are there any other models out there that you've just thought, wow, that could be interesting to look at in the future? And then we'll go to Kristen after that.
Yeah, I think the way I might frame that response is opportunities to even expand and broaden our impact and our effectiveness through creative, funding injection. And I think one of the themes I've heard just from our other panelists is the grant money that's available. There's so much opportunity in grants out there. A lot of times, if you just go after them, you can get some, because a lot of grants just sit there and no one ever applies for them. And our board is not really equipped to apply for grants, but fortunately, the city of Arvada is well equipped to apply, and we actually have an entire team dedicated inside the city of Arvada, which most local governments have a person or a team that apply for and manage grant funds, because there's a lot of infrastructure projects and other initiatives and social issues and housing and authorities and lots of things that exist inside local government. So we actually can, when those opportunities present themselves, go and partner with the city of Arvada's finance team and say, there's some money out there that we think is in alignment with our mission, that we think we can deploy in some interesting ways for some positive impact. Would you help us go after those grants as the city of Arvada? And if those come in, those can be managed in partnership with the economic development staff. So it's a way to kind of go after and compete for grant funds, even though our 501c6 volunteer board is not equipped to do that. And I guess the point here would be, if you are a leader of an economic development organization, don't count yourself out of any funding opportunity. If there's a way to do it and it's appropriate and legal, and it's helpful, and you have the capacity to spend that money in a way that gets you the positive outcomes, I would say be open-minded and be vigilant to seek those opportunities out.
Great. And I see as well on that question with the grants, Tyler had a question for you around maybe, Daniel, if you have a couple of examples of grant funds that you've received. And
so it's been a few years. I want to say the last ones that we did were in partnership with infrastructure projects. So they were economic development led conversations where businesses, and we live in a very dog-legged, Jansen could probably relate to this, our geographical borders of Arvada, between unincorporated Jefferson County, unincorporated Adams County, Westminster, Wheat Ridge, Golden, there are a lot of infrastructure pockets that are kind of left unattended to and create really difficult challenges for industrial and logistics companies that have trucks moving in and out, and there's really unsafe intersections, and you've got traffic backed up, and you've got companies losing hundreds of thousands of dollars a year because their trucks are just idling at an intersection for 15 minutes before they can get out and onto the highway. And so those conversations start with the economic development group, because those businesses have the relationship and they're saying, this is a problem. If we can't fix this, we need to go to a different community or a different place where this is not a problem. And we might just say, hey, that's not our bailiwick. We're not transportation people. We are not engineers. We are not CDOT or whatever. But we can still lead and convene those conversations and bring in the city to apply and support them in application of grant funds that can be used to solve and fix those problems or make those public improvements. Another example is with the rail. The railroad sometimes can be a really significant impediment to business health, because a train stopped across a road, which is the only route for employees and goods to get into a business park or an industrial development, can be highly problematic. And so those types of projects take tens or hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes to move a railroad. And so again, sometimes those conversations will start with the economic development group, and we'll convene our stakeholders in the city, including grant writers, as well, or we can come in and support those infrastructure projects with supplemental information and reinforcement about the economic impact that those grant funds could lead to. So it's a little bit more, I guess, broad when we're thinking about municipal level work, because it touches so many things. But I don't have any recent examples of just getting money specifically just for economic development purposes.
Okay. Does Jansen or Kristen have any examples they want to share? If not, we can move on to the next question. But if you have any examples you'd like to share as it relates to grants that you've received?
Well, so not received, but you asked about other groups and things that we've been maybe massaging. There's two things that I've been trying to pitch and would love to see. We had this, I moved here from Spartanburg, South Carolina, and one of the cool mechanisms that we had there was for any incentive agreement and anything that we worked through, the company, there was a little bit of a cutback of taxes back to our organization. And so we used heavily fee in lieu of tax agreements. And that led to about $2.5 million a year into our economic development organization, just by getting cuts off of tax revenue that's flowing back to projects that we work, which means the more projects we put out there, the more cash that we had, because we became an ingrained part of that incentive structure. It's a little bit tougher here on how the property taxes flow. I'd love to see a mechanism. I think Denver South gets a cut back on taxes. There may be the only one that does. But creative and something that I do think is in our control, or we need to look at, is how can we even incentivize our work and get a little bit of a flow back on that. And like I said, it really allowed for perpetuity for 20, 30 years, because that's how long most of our agreements were in South Carolina. There was pretty much a guaranteed stream of $2.5 million a year to backfill for economic development. The second, and I did pitch our county, and I have not gotten much love on this one, but with ARPA and all these funds, I thought there was a really good opportunity to build out some economic vitality funds, ones that go and sit in investment accounts, and you're able to tap into the interest. I really would have loved to have seen that happen. And I think what it could have done is protected the principal from our counties and our cities, while the organization can pull off the interest. And then you have a net zero, or actually a positive cash flow back to the county or the city ongoing. So, we had looked, our county got about 113 million in ARPA. I had penciled it out to, if they would put $5 million into an economic vitality fund, that the interest off of that would replace what their annual investment is to us, and that principal would be guaranteed in perpetuity. So in other words, if our organization went out in 10 years, that full 5 million would come back to the county and be protected because we could only touch on the interest, and then they would take away an ongoing expense. If your county or city has not used all that ARPA funds, maybe explore it. I know that it's a little bit nuanced. I know it may have to come out of the general fund and you replace it with ARPA funds, but I think that there's some economic vitality and there's some investment that can be made out there that builds perpetuity, because it is tough to have to go fight every year for these funds. And Daniel touched on that. We've got every bit of statistic. I can tell you the money that's been invested in our organization on the over 20 years puts back into their pockets $20 to $40 million in direct revenue every single year. And so the return on investment's 20, 30 times. And yet we still go and have to fight. So how do we pull that down? Because every minute we have to go out there and fight for those funds and go and recruit those funds is a minute that we don't get to go work on economic development.
Very true. The funding is a necessary distraction, unfortunately, from sometimes the great work that we're trying to do as economic development organizations. So thank you for that. Kristen, over to you. Are there any creative funding models that you're considering or have seen within other economic development organizations or even outside of the industry that you'd like to share?
No, I can't really think of any. The one thing we have done is created a subcommittee for our investors to where they're more involved in our strategic planning and guide our work. And one of them, we call it Route 76. And what that does, and some conversations that I've had, is it allows that engagement, that nurturing that they do need, but then that work is focused. And I found that a few investors have been willing to contribute more money, knowing exactly where it's going. So we're able to do programming, because for smaller organizations or one-person operations, you're focused on your operational budget every year, and the money you're raising is going just to keeping the doors open to try to do work. So we had to get a little creative in how we engage and raise more money locally, and squeeze every bit more out that we can from them. So having that targeted work that they're getting that immediate benefit from, and then seeing the value of economic development, because economic development is that long-term investment, the return on your investment over a period of time, but everybody wants to see something now. So asking for a little bit more money now to do a program where they can see that benefit, and then it builds up over time.
Great, Kristen. It brings up another question I have for you as well. And correct me if I'm wrong, Kristen, are you just the sole employee there for the Morgan County, or there's one or two of you?
So I'm the full-time employee, and I have a part-time assistant in the office.
Okay, great. So again, I'm sure we have lots of folks on the call as well that are in that same position where, it's one individual trying to actually do and follow through on the mission and be there with the businesses to support them. And then obviously you have this funding piece of it that you have to kind of keep going as well. From a capacity standpoint, how do you manage that, Kristen? And how do you keep all of the trains on the tracks? And, what does your percentage of time look like that? And how do you do all of that?
I definitely derail occasionally. But I would say the collaboration that's been developed over the last year and a half has been key. Collaboration among my board, collaboration with the city governments. One tool we've used, or one avenue I've taken, is really promoting economic development as a resource for businesses and introducing them to their city managers or their community development managers, and helping nurture that relationship so they can work together and I can step away. A couple examples: in Wiggins, we have a meat processor that went through an expansion, and the city applied for a grant through DOLA to help with the infrastructure for that, because there was job creation. So finding those different avenues of partnership that can alleviate my workload, but get the expansions and other projects done, and then helping the cities get to know their businesses. So it's a consistent partnership has helped a lot. We're also an enterprise zone. So MCEDC is set up as an enterprise zone project. So that's an incentive for investors to the C6. They still get some sort of tax benefit, but then it starts the conversation of what is an enterprise zone and how can you as a business benefit from that. So that's another potential program for us, is introducing in September enterprise zones to the businesses and how they can get different incentives for fleet trucks or new hires and all of those. And then we recently joined Rural Jumpstart. So we've got 3 applications. I think 3 applications going through that right now. So a lot of it isn't always internal. It's just having conversations like this to hear of other opportunities, and then sharing that information out and kind of encouraging, here's the information, now go and, work with that. And if you need help, let me know. But you have to put some of it, for us in the smaller rural areas, putting some of it back on the businesses when they're looking for that help.
And
Excellent.
Kristen, Kristen, didn't you also have a workforce development grant?
We did. We got the rural workforce innovative workforce grant. We got $150,000 for that, and that'll flow through the Route 76 to help our investor businesses target direct to workforce individuals in the county. We lose about 800 to 1,000 18 to 24-year-olds every year, and where the state of Colorado sees an influx, we see the out migration. So we're trying to target those individuals through that grant to help build up the local workforce.
Excellent. I think that's very, very helpful for a lot of the smaller rural economic development organizations to kind of see how they can leverage those businesses to support and act as really an extension of what you're trying to do as a community. So thank you for that. Also, Daniel, I see put a response into the chat as well regarding the grants and more detail there. And Daniel, a question for you around adapting your funding strategies to respond to changing economic conditions, right? Or unforeseen events. We've already slightly touched on this when you had said, like, you know, elections, right, could be a piece. But again, we've a lot of different things happening right now in the in terms of our economic conditions, and how do you adapt to that? And or have you some thoughts on how you might adapt?
Yeah, one actually active conversation we're having with the board now is strategic savings of funds that they get from city council. We kind of transitioned from a model of being rather inactive in the early 90s to wanting to spend every penny we got on something important and impactful, and demonstrate that when we get those funds from city council, hey, look at all the good things we're putting these funds towards, and look at all this return. And the more we invest, the more returns we get. However, COVID kind of gave us pause to think about hedging for rainy days. What if the city finds itself in a position where it doesn't have any funds to provide to our organization, or is operating in a deficit or something? I think a lot of municipalities faced that actual situation during COVID. We were fortunate in Arvada that didn't happen. The board actually loaned $100,000 to the city of Arvada during COVID, and forewent some commitments that the city council had made, so that the city, in partnership with AIDA, could set up a small business COVID relief loan fund, which actually turned into a grant fund after some of the CARES Act money came through, and we realized we didn't need to repay some of those things. But we ended up in a situation where we were wishing we had more in the bank, to lean on. Unfortunately, things didn't turn out that way, and it was rather good financial situation for us through COVID and beyond. But I think now the board is thinking about that next wave. Like, what could it be? Could there be an economic recession on the horizon? If inflation continues to grow at the pace it's growing, could we see some bubbles burst? And do we have enough reserves to really withstand a prolonged period of time to get through a potential season where we don't get any new injections from the city? And so that's a very current and real conversation we're having. And it's really about the balance. Again, what's the right amount to save? And can we go to the city and say, hey, can you give us more than we're asking for to spend, so that we can save, and that we've got that rainy day situation? And is that appropriate? Can the community tolerate that, knowing we have some of that in the bank? And can the council tolerate that, or do they want to see every dollar invested? So that's, I guess, the best way I could respond to your question.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel. And the same to Jansen. Is there anything in particular that Jeffco are doing in terms of preparing for any future perhaps upsets or distractions in economic conditions?
Distractions. I mean, I don't know that you can throw us a bigger curveball than what COVID had, but as far as preparation, we do have a couple grants out around entrepreneurship. I mentioned earlier that, as we look at verticals and what we're launching and what we're trying to build more mechanisms around, entrepreneurship is something that's fallen not quite as high a priority across the county, but we have some grant money requests out for that to help jumpstart that. But again, we can only do what we bring in funds to do. And so there's not a capacity on this current model, but we're looking at what we can build and where we can maybe pull in some of those resources to build a runway around entrepreneurship. Other than that, I do think that this has been really a good eye opener that we don't need to spend our reserves down. And so each of our verticals need to be self-sustaining. We may not make money in each vertical, but each one should at least be able to cover its cost each year. And so I think we've been very mindful of that and balancing our spend versus what our income is, and being realistic in that. When you lose those events, which many times, especially on the chamber side of the equation, is a major part of your revenue line, it can throw your model upside down. So how do you make sure that your core and your base revenue can support, and then that you can scale up and down based on what these the conditions that are completely out of your control? Excellent.
And then to all of the panelists, have any has there been any successful in your organizations or other organizations that looking to use some forms of technology for fundraising, so like crowdfunding opportunities? Does that work within the customer segment that you're serving and what you're trying to achieve, or have you had any experience with that? Okay, great. So again, yeah, just looking at those other innovative pieces, and again, how maybe venture capital supports, again, depending on the structure of your organization, if you're a nonprofit, if you're government, etc. But again, some of those other sources that other industries, I think that's what's always very interesting as we look to other industries and see what they're leveraging for their funding sources. It can be often a very innovative way to think about how we can bring that into the economic development space and leverage some of those, obviously making the adjustments to meet the needs. And then actually Kim as well here is about events, and really all about, Kim just said events should only cover the cost of the event, and anything that comes above and beyond is icing on the cake. So on that, then we feel like with events, again, when we're doing funding, there's often the funnel. So some of our funding actually plays into gaining visibility to support other funding mechanisms and models. So would anyone like to just kind of discuss that again, Janssen or Kristen or Daniel, around how you kind of structure your funding model? Not all of it will actually result in, the dollars, but some of it is strategically placed to serve another portion of your funding model. So Janssen, I'll put that over to you, and then we'll move to Kristen and Daniel as well.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why we cut back on how many events and programs that we do, because they are costly. And so you've got to balance the time. So we do an annual event called the Gateways. That's what we kind of landed at every November. And it's a break even, lose a little bit of money event, but it brings out 250 leaders. It celebrates businesses. And we do it, and my board has said, we do this for the benefit of the community to bring us back together. But we have the right context in mind, because it is expensive to put on events. That particular one cost me $190 a head. And so trying to recoup back that is tough. So I'm very glad that the board looks at it in that way. And they said, this is not something we do to make money. This is something we do to celebrate the successes of the year. The chamber side of that equation is different, because when you do put that much time and resources to it, you need to make some money off of it for it to really make sense, or you have to stop doing it. Because again, it comes back to time and resources. So every minute, every staff hour I put towards putting on something that breaks even is time that they're not in with their members, not building other relationships, not building educational programs. And so my EDC lens and view on this is a little different than my chamber lens and view on this. But the EDC, there's also doesn't come the expectation from our investors like it is on the chamber side of the equation. The membership base and the investor base is very different with very different expectations. So on that EDC side, I go back to land use, advocacy, and policy. That's where I have to spend my time and resources, because that's where the money comes from. On the chamber side, we're going to look more at programs and events.
Great, thank you. And same to you, Kristen. Again, how do you set up your funding model? So some of it, again, may not be profitable, but it is in fact perhaps helping leverage some of your other funding sources. How do you think through that process? And if so, maybe what are some of the things that you're doing to support that?
think we look at events a little bit differently as far as raising money or fundraisers from the economic development side. We view those as marketing and marketing our organization to businesses. And so we started having quarterly luncheons, and we do ask for sponsors, especially companies looking at Morgan County. So last year, Morgan County's addressed transition community. So last year we had a ton of, we still do, renewable energy companies coming out and talking to businesses and landowners. So I asked one of them to sponsor our lunch. So they paid for the lunch, and the space was provided by an investor business. So it gives the investor business that spotlight. Lunch was covered, but then we give that engagement with our members. So we really use it as a marketing tool. And if we have a little money go out for it, that's what it is. We have an annual meeting as well, and that one we do lose money on, much like Jansen. But this year we had 130 people, and it's a huge reach for our region and getting elected officials from local and outside the county together. And then we had Elizabeth Gardner as a speaker, and then we also had somebody from CSU Ready come out and as a guest speaker, and then a renewable project was a guest. So there's a lot of valuable information, and so we get that large audience we don't always have capacity to. So we kind of look at it from a different perspective. And then our C3, we have the foundation. We last year did our first fundraising event at Bobstock, which is a music festival over 2 days. Little shout out. It's the second weekend of July, and anybody that likes 38 Special, they're here this year on Saturday, and it's free. But we do the beer garden with the chamber. So we show that partnership within the community with the two organizations. And this year we'll market what the money is for a little bit better than we did last year. It was our first event, so we didn't really say we're selling beer to raise money for businesses. But that's a great event too, and it's a one-time. And last year, each organization netted $12,000 over 2 days. So for us, that's a big deal, and we look forward to continually doing that over the next year. But that's also a marketing tool for us.
Great. I love the way that you separate that out very clearly in your business model, that's marketing and that's funding, because sometimes you may stop doing those things if you don't see the return, but really clarifying that specifically into those two categories is very helpful. And then finally to you, Daniel, we'll wrap up with, if there's, again, I know maybe this isn't something that you consider given you have a very different structure to your funding model, but are there other events or outside of events that you use to kind of support the funding model that you have today?
Yeah, and maybe to answer this question, I'll take a step back in time about 10 years to my days with Adams County Economic Development, which has gone through some transitions in the past few years. But my role at that organization was around business retention, and we did a lot of events and raised sponsorships. And I believe there is actually a strong connection between investor relations and business retention, and it's something I think a lot of organizations may be able to leverage. If you're bringing your primary employers to the table, if you're engaged with them because your business retention program is providing a lot of great value, you're helping them solve problems, you're connecting them with resources, a lot of that is free. From what I would imagine, no one's charging businesses in your community to support them with your business retention programs. It's such a great value add in creating these really strong relationships. And then when you invite them to come and network and don't charge them to do that, a lot of times your investors, if you bring them into that fold and you're really hyper aware of the needs of those businesses that you've been working with, you can make some really great introductions and really great handoffs and referrals to your investor base that gets them coming back to the table and re-upping and reinvesting and re-sponsoring. And so that was kind of the connection we made back then, and times may have changed. It's been a while since I've been in that particular role, but I think that there is an opportunity to kind of think holistically about what's the relationship between your business retention program, your events and marketing, and what types of things you're putting together, and putting your investors right in the center of that so that they're reaping these rewards of relationships and deal making and whatever it is that's keeping them coming back to the table. Because just being honest with our fellow economic development peers here, a lot of investors say it's altruism. We're here to support the region. We're here to support economic development. Rising tide floats all boats. But at the end of the day, they're accountable for the money they put into your organization when they go to their CEO or whoever is writing that check and saying, what is the benefit of continuing to put $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a year into this organization? and they'll have a plethora of examples to share of the relationships and deals if you're really thoughtful and strategic about coordinating those efforts.
Excellent. And I think that goes back to your point as well earlier, Daniel, all about those performance metrics and being able to measure and quantify the work that you've done and being able to prove that not only to your funders, but also to the community at large. And if you're working especially with public funding, having those, being able to have those quantifiable checkpoints. So I'm going to wrap up there and hand it over to Kim, but I just want to say fascinating conversation. I personally have learned so much from our panelists, so thank you so much for taking the time to share. And as Kim put into the chat, I couldn't agree more. Clear missions help drive the ship. Obviously, being involved in strategy, I think that's the most important thing, is don't allow your funding models to drive your strategy and your mission. Make sure your mission and your strategy are going to inform your funding models. So thank you all, and over to Kim.
Thank you so much, Kate, and to the panel. That was awesome. I'm hoping that everybody really got a nugget today, or 2 nuggets that they can take back. Again, this will be offered up. We will send out this recording as well as the presentation. So again, thank you to our contributors for sharing your perspective with us today. If you want to connect with any of the contributors afterwards, please let us know and we'll make those connections. Again, today's programming was brought to you by City of Westminster and Xcel Energy. Thank you again for your continued support for ECC's educational resources. Thanks again to our Professional Development Committee for always putting together an amazing panel and topics that really help us drive economic development activities in our communities. And again, a link, as I just said, follow-up items, recording presentations, all the follow-up resources will be emailed to you this week. And we're also, Bobby's putting in a survey into the chat section. Please take that survey for us. It's a 5-minute, very simple survey, but that's really how we keep bettering ourselves as well, because again, we are a nonprofit organization that is always bettering and trying to provide those resources and tools and knowledge for our constituency. And as we've mentioned several times before, we hope to see you all in Fort Morgan on May 10th. This is our first regional since 2020, so we're excited to get back to it. But on the agenda, it's the same stuff that we're all talking about. It's housing, it's water, it's this green energy movement that is a once in a lifetime industry build out. So all of these topics that we're talking about, they might be focused on the Eastern Plains, but those are the same topics we're all dealing with. So great opportunity to share some of that knowledge and what is happening on the Eastern Plains. Again, here's our calendar, and if you're interested in signing up for our basic economic development course, please do so. And then again, finally, visit our website for resources and tools that you need to be successful in your economic development efforts. Take care, everyone, and we hope to see you in person in May. And don't forget to celebrate Economic Development Week. Bye, everybody.